Greetings, booktubers, and welcome back to Grammaticus Books. Welcome back to a What the Grok Happened to Heinlein episode of Grammaticus Books. So that is the question we're going to answer today. And why are we asking this question? We're asking this question because of two books. And the first book is Robert E. Heinlein's Starship Troopers, widely considered to be one of the most conservative science fiction novels written by a mainstream sci-fi author. And the other book is Stranger in a Strange Land, also written by Robert E. Heinlein, and considered to be one of the most progressive, new age, communal, free love books ever written by a mainstream science fiction author. And these two books written by Heinlein were written within 2 years of each other. Troopers came out in 1959, and Stranger in a Strange Land came out in 1961, just 2 years after. And they're written by the same author. So what the grok happened to get Heinlein from this super conservative book to this super liberal book? And I hear you asking me, what is this word grok that you keep using, Grammaticus? And grok is a word that was created by Heinlein in his book, Stranger in a Strange Land. It's supposed to be a quote-unquote Martian word, and Heinlein uses it to mean basically anything that he wants, from a four-letter expletive starting with the letter F to a four-letter verb starting with the letter F, and yes, you're thinking of the same word that I am, all the way to a phrase that means a deep understanding of something and anything in between. But we're going to co-opt it here to mean what the grok happened to Heinlein and use it here in our video. So what we're going to do to answer this question is I'm going to very briefly go over Starship Troopers, the history of Starship Troopers, very briefly. And then we're going to go into Stranger in a Strange Land in a little more depth because I just finished this book. It's almost 500 pages, 498 pages. I just wrapped it up. We'll go over it, and then we'll try to put Robert E. Heinlein's personal and political life into a perspective of these two novels that came out so close to each other, and try to figure out if we can put the pieces of the puzzle together to figure out what happened in order to shift Heinlein apparently in such a groundbreaking dynamic shift from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum. I mean, if this book over here is matter, this book is antimatter. And if I were to touch them together, if I were to let them actually touch matter and antimatter, I think the entire area here around Graham's End and the Shire might disappear in a flash of light. But it is a very interesting exercise, and we are going to try to see if we can figure it out. So we'll go ahead and get started. There will be some minor spoilers in here, so just be warned about minor spoilers. So Robert E. Heinlein, 1959, Starship Troopers. This is considered to be the seminal book, kind of ground zero for creating the genre of military science fiction. And it's about Juan Rico, a young man who joins the mobile infantry in the Terran Federation to go off and fight the Arachnids. And like I said, it's considered the seminal book for military science fiction, and it's also considered the book that invented the whole idea and concept of powered suits of power armor. And so it's famous for that. But it's also equally famous for its very conservative ideas that Heinlein puts forth in this book. The bulk of this book, 80% of it, is actually Heinlein just going into a treatise on his idea of a utopian government. And his idea of a utopian government is a democracy, but it's an exceptionally limited democracy where the only people who have full citizenship and who are allowed to vote are veterans of the military, which is obviously a very controversial and very conservative idea. He also puts forth a number of other conservative and controversial ideas where he attacks the Bill of Rights numerous times, and he puts forth a number of other controversial lightning rods that draw a lot of criticism down on this book, including all the way up to the point of having it being called a fascist novel, which is a stretch, but it is certainly exceptionally conservative. And that is Heinlein's Starship Troopers, 1959. So then we move over to Stranger in a Strange Land, just 2 years later. This is his next major novel that he publishes right after Starship Troopers. And it says this book here, Stranger in a Strange Land. It's about a boy from Mars. And in a nutshell, the plot is that a boy is rescued off of Mars from a shipwrecked expedition that went there and discovered that Mars is inhabited by highly intelligent beings. And the only survivor of this expedition is a young boy who was born on the way to Mars by the spaceship, by these humans on the spaceship. He's taken and adopted by the Martians, and he's raised on Mars by the Martians. kind of like Tarzan with the apes, except the apes are a lot smarter. And they raise the boy all the way up to the age of 20, where a second expedition then gets there, retrieves him, and brings this boy back to Earth. And the boy's name is Valentine Michael Smith. And on Earth, the boy is adopted by a father figure by the name of Jubal Karshaw. Now, Jubal Karshaw is a self-insert for Heinlein into the book. And Jubal Karshaw type figures appear in numerous numbers of Heinlein books. And they're almost always on a older, elder statesman type of gentleman who's very wise in the ways of the world. And he's typically either a doctor, an attorney, or a writer. But in this book here, Heinlein saw fit to make Jubal Karshaw all three. He's a doctor, an attorney, and a writer, all rolled into one. Heinlein just went for the full Monty on this one in his self-insert. And in addition to that, Jubal Karshaw runs a very large estate where he has 4 women who help him run his estate. They're all professional women. But in addition to helping him run the estate, they also assist him and anybody else who comes on to the estate with other personal matters, shall we say. Yes, you are thinking along the correct lines. So he's, in addition to make himself a doctor, an attorney, and a writer, he's also set himself up as Hugh Hefner at this point in the novel. So Jubal adopts Michael, that's how he's referred to commonly in the book, the boy from Mars. And he teaches him the ways of the world. He gets him ready to go out into the world. And then Michael does, in fact, go out into the world, where he discovers that the United States of this time period in the book is a place that is full of sin and corruption and people who are not living up to their potential. And he decides he's going to take his lessons from Mars and he's going to fix the Earth. And he does so by creating the Church of All Worlds. So he creates this church, he gathers a bunch of converts and disciples, and the Church of All Worlds is then going to spread its message out across the earth. And the message is one of commune, of coming together, no possessions, and it's a religious function where you initiate people into it and keep them initiated through group orgies and group sex. And this is where the book goes. I won't spoil the ending of it. I think that's pretty much everything you need to know about the book at this point. But at this point in my head, I'm thinking, all right, we have gone from Hugh Hefner to a blueprint for the Manson family. And this is exactly what went through my head. And so much so that I had to go out and I put a little Google foo out. And sure shinola, Charles Manson did in fact read Stranger in a Strange Land and did use the Church of All Worlds as a blueprint for the Manson family, so much so that the Mansons actually used the word grok and grokking, and he adopted their water sharing ceremony, which was one of the ceremonies and initiations in the Church of All Worlds that's used in this book for their twisted and wacko family. So Heinlein, in large part, formed the foundation for Charles Manson and the Manson family, which I found to be just astounding. So that's the book, Stranger in a Strange Land. So what the GROK happened to Heinlein? How did we go from, well, let me find it here, from matter to antimatter in the space of one novel in 2 years? Well, if you ask the pundits, if you look at the New Republic magazine article on this point, if you reference William Patterson's autobiography, his authorized autobiography of Heinlein, he alludes to it as well, and many of the other talking heads, they're going to point universally to Heinlein's third marriage as being that turning point in his life that turned him onto a more conservative path. Now, Heinlein had 3 wives. He married one in 1927. His second wife he married in 1932, and he married the love of his life, Virginia, in 1947. The first 2 marriages were to very liberal social democrats, and then the third marriage was to a very conservative naval officer who was also a Republican, and they point to that marriage as being the turning point towards his conservative viewpoints. I don't agree with that. I think there's some problems with it, namely that after he's married to Virginia in 1947, in 1961, he's still authoring this New Age commune free love manifesto here that's called Stranger in a Strange Land. So it really doesn't account for his writing. If you ask Heinlein himself why his politics changed apparently, and he was asked this frequently, the answer that he gave was always the same. It didn't vary at all, ever, whenever he was asked this question. And his answer was, my politics haven't changed at all. I've had the very same politics when I was a social democrat back in the late 20s as I do now in the 50s and the 60s and even into the 70s. His argument instead was that the social democrats and the Republicans had both veered so far and strayed so far to the left over the intervening decades that his old social democratic policies from the 20s began to look more and more and more conservative, when in fact he had been consistent and the Democrats and the Republicans were the ones who had shifted to the left. And that was his explanation. I think there was some truth to that. And I think a lot of that truth can be seen in his writing and how his politics actually stay amazingly consistent throughout his writing, such as with the domestic policies for capital punishment. He was very pro-capital punishment, even back when he was writing young adult science fiction, like in this novel right here, Have Space Who Will Travel. There's a very pro-capital punishment chapter in a young adult novel here with Have Space Who Will Travel. That then continues with pro-capital punishment quotes and chapters here in Starship Troopers. And then in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which is a very libertarian novel published in 1966. It is also pro-capital punishment. And even in Stranger in a Strange Land, again, his new age communal free sex and love for everybody. If you crossed certain moral boundaries, if you attempted to rape a woman, if you threatened somebody with a gun or tried to kill somebody, he was in favor of having you murdered and offed right there on the spot. And that happens a lot in this book, Stranger in a Strange Land. So he's consistent with those policies. And I think he's also consistent with his military policies. You've got to remember that his foreign policy and his domestic policy are potentially two different things, and I think they are two different things. Even when he's advocating for and backing social democrats in the late 20s and the early 30s, Robert Heinlein is a member of the military. He joins of his own free will the Naval Academy and is a midshipman and then serves in the Navy. He was very pro-military, even when he was at his, allegedly his most liberal in the late 20s. And that viewpoint, I think, continues on through up into his later books and his later part of his life. He was always pro-military. And at the same time, he was always very pro-libertarian when it came to domestic policies and to personal policies and personal freedoms. In the 1920s and the 30s and the 40s, in all three of his marriages were open marriages and polyamorous, where people were coming into his house from the 20s all the way up through the 40s to when he died and engaging in free sex in his homes across his entire life. So while he's writing Starship Troopers, which is this allegedly very conservative novel, he's also leading a very liberal personal private lifestyle of libertarianism. And here's the thought for you. When he was married to his second wife, it said that L. Ron Hubbard was a frequent guest at his house, and he, L. Ron Hubbard, and his second wife often wound up in threesomes in bed. Yeah, get that image out of your head, I dare you. So it's consistent. He has a consistent viewpoint. And I believe that that, in fact, is fairly true. I think that he had a very consistent viewpoint, and it wasn't until 1961 that he becomes comfortable enough to start writing about his personal libertarian policies and his policies on, living in the home and sex. And the reason he starts to feel comfortable to do that in 1961 is you have the advent of Timothy Leary in California, and other so-called social radicals are coming out. And at this point, I think he feels comfortable enough to write about it. So if you look at his writing, if you look at his policies, and you look at it across his books over the decades, he actually is very consistent. So what the GROK happened to Robert A. Heinlein? I would argue absolutely grokking nothing. But I'd love to hear your guys' comments. Put your comments down in the comments section below. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you have different ideas on it. But that is my opinion. I think he was very consistent. And I want to end by showing you guys a few photographs out of the authorized biography here by William Patterson. So here's a picture of Robert Heinlein in the early 30s as a midshipman at the Naval Academy. It's a picture of his second wife, Leslyn, posing as a woodland nymph. which is a fairly interesting picture. This is a picture of Heinlein in his studio, his writing studio in the 1940s. And then over here, he's working in a naval think tank during the war in 1945, and that's him at the think tank. And then my favorite picture, here you've got L. Sprague de Camp, Isaac Asimov, and Heinlein all together working in that same naval think tank during 1945, during World War II. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall. Can you imagine the conversations that those three gentlemen had in that naval think tank during World War II, trying to come up with new technologies and new weapons? You can only imagine the stories that these guys were telling each other. But that's it. That is what the GROK happened to Heinlein. And again, I would argue nothing. I think he was very consistent with his policies and his outlooks on life, both foreign and domestic. But I would, again, love to hear your guys' comments. Put them down in the comment section below. It's late. I've had a very long day. I need to wrap this up because I'm having trouble stringing words together. So I'm going to say take care, be safe, and I'll catch you guys on the bounce.